Welcome to part 2 of Exodus Music Theory. In this presentation we'll cover some simple chords. This will actually cover most of the chord types that we'll see in most of the tunes that we do, and most of them are not that difficult to understand once you understand some fundamental concepts. Again, remember that all of the materials for this are available at this short URL, so you can scan that with your phone or go to the URL listed below for all of the presentations, all the materials, some background materials and things like that. One of the fundamental concepts that we'll talk about in this presentation, or one of the things that we need to understand, is when we say that a song is in a particular key. So if we say that a song is in the key of D or a song is in the key of A, what that means is that all of the notes in that song, or at least that part of the song or most of the song, are going to be from the scale of that key. So if we're in the key of D, the only notes, or most of the notes in the song, are going to be D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and D. And then if you had a musical score instead of a lead sheet, it would have that key signature at the beginning. So it would have F sharp and C sharp marked. And then it also means that that certain chords will be used more often in the song than others. And in the next presentation, we'll actually talk about which chords those are and how you can identify the key of the song even if the lead sheet doesn't say it. So that you can determine the key of a song even if it doesn't say explicitly. As an example, in the key of D, 99% of the notes that are played in that song are going to be from the D major scale: D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, and C sharp. You're just not going to see a G sharp when you're in the key of D. You actually could see a G sharp. That might be the first accidental that you would actually see. Chords in Western music are built on thirds. They help to identify, when you use thirds, it helps to identify, it gives gravity to the chord so that you understand the character of the chord. It's pretty easy to identify the root of the chord and things like that. When chords are built on fourths or fifths, it actually takes away tonality and character. It makes it difficult to determine what the root of the chord is, because it can, the inverse of a fourth is a fifth, and both of them sound very similar to one another. Now in heavy metal, there aren't a lot of thirds actually. Most power chords are based on open fifths. But in most Western music, and I mean Western Hemisphere, not country and Western, chords are built on thirds, so either minor thirds or major thirds. In the music that we play, octaves are irrelevant most of the time, which means that which octave that a note is in or how the chord is stacked actually doesn't change the root or the name of the chord. For example, all of the chords listed at the bottom there are C chords because they have C, E, and G, even though C is not in the root on the last one. For example, the first one is C in the root, C in the bass, E above that, and G above that, and that's a C major chord. But the next one over in the second bar there is a C in the bass, a G above that, and an E above that. The third, if you stack that in thirds, that's C, E, and G. The last one, there's an E in the bass and a G above that, and then an E above that and a C up at the top, which seems like it's completely upside down. But if you turn that into thirds, the only way to make thirds out of that is C, E, and G. So all three of those chords are considered C chords or C major chords. Major chords are a root and then a major third above that, so 4 half steps above that, and then a minor third above that. And again, octaves are irrelevant, so you rearrange the chords or the notes in the chord however you need to in order to get octaves out of it, and or not octaves, how to get thirds out of it, and that becomes your chord. And again, the octaves are irrelevant, so inversions, for the classically trained, inversions don't really matter. So it could be 6 or an octave plus a third, and so you'll see a lot of 6 or maybe a perfect fifth and then a third above that, or but there's generally going to be some way to stack the chord unless there are 4 notes. There's generally going to be some way to stack it in thirds and make a 3-note chord out of it. But that chord is going to be a root somewhere, a major third above that, and again, octaves are irrelevant, and then a minor third somewhere above that. The chord is named after the root of the note. So in the case of E, G, and C, if you rearrange that into thirds, that becomes C, E, and G, and so it's named after the root, so that's a C chord. If you've got A, F sharp, and D, the way to arrange those so that it's thirds is D to F sharp is a major third, F sharp to A is a minor third, so D, F sharp, A, so that is a D chord. And when we're learning chords, we will generally put the root in the bass and then stack the others as thirds. So when we write it on a score, it's easier to visualize just written out in thirds, even though the way that it's played on a guitar may be a little bit inverted. So here are some examples of major chords. The first one is a C major. From C to E is a major third, and from E to G is a minor third. So that is a C major chord. That sounds like this. The second chord is G to B, which is a major third, and then B to D, which is a minor third. And that sounds like this. And then the last one is F sharp major. So F sharp to A sharp is a major third, and then A sharp to C sharp is a minor third. And that sounds like this. These 3 chords are exactly the same, or spelled the same way. Again, if you take out, if you stack them back into thirds, the first one has a C in the bass, and then a G above that, and then a C, and then an E way above that. But the way to stack that in thirds is C, E, and G. So that is a C chord. The next one is a G, and then a B, an octave and a third above that, and then a G, a 6 above that, and then a D, a fifth above that. And so that is, but the way that is stacked, that is still G, B, and D, and so it is a G major chord. The last one, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, A sharp, the way to put that into thirds is F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp, and so that is still an F sharp major chord. This is all of the major chords that you can have, at least in our scale, or plain vanilla major chords, and those are all the notes that will show up in those. Granted, when you get to the bottom of the list on either side, the keys get a little bit weird, like C sharp, E sharp, and G sharp. You know, E sharp sounds like F, but C sharp to F is some sort of a fourth, whereas C sharp to E sharp is actually a major third. Yes, they sound the same note, but the way that somebody is spelling the chord, it would be C sharp to E sharp. We don't play in those keys too much, so don't worry too much about that E sharp and F are the same note. Minor chords are a root, a minor third above that, and then a major third above that. So if you take a major chord and you just flat the third of it, so take your C chord, which is C, E, and G, and you change the E to an E flat, then that becomes a C minor chord. Just like with major chords, octaves are irrelevant, so inversions don't really matter for those who are classically trained and think that inversions do matter. With the music that we're playing, inversions aren't really that important. Again, it might be 6 in an octave or a 6 in a fifth or something like that. But there's a root somewhere, and then you can stack a minor third above that and a major third above that. Just like with a major chord, the chord is named after the root note when you stack them in thirds, but then you put a lowercase m after it to denote minor. Just like with major chords, when we learn them, we'll generally put the root in the bass and then stack the others as thirds above that. So a minor chord sounds like this. Okay, so here is C major, and here is C minor. D major, oops, and then D minor. So that's what a minor chord sounds like. Here are some examples. These are just the minor form of the very chords that we had looked at before. So instead of C major, we've got C minor now. Notice that the E is flat now instead of natural. The G minor chord is just like the G major, except that you flat the third. So G, B flat, and D. F sharp minor is just like F sharp major, except that instead of an A sharp, you've got an A natural now, 1/2 step lower. Another way to think of chords is as a perfect fifth and then a third, either a major third and a minor third. For example, a G chord is any form of a G chord is going to be a G and a D, and then either a major third, which would be a B above the root, or a minor third above the root, so a B flat. The next type of chord that we'll talk about is seventh chords. If you are classically trained, this is going to be a little bit different than how you understand seventh chords. In classical music, there are many different types of seventh chords because there are at least 4 different ways to make a seventh chord out of just major and minor chords. But when in the music that we play, when you see a seventh, it just means add a seventh to the chord that's written there in whatever key that you're in, which may sound a little bit confusing. But if we're in the key of D, if you see E minor 7, that means you play an E minor chord, which is E, G, and B, and then the next third above the fifth of that, or the seventh up from E, in the key of D is a D. It's not a D sharp or a D flat. It's a D. So E minor 7 sounds like this. You've got E, G, B, and then D. If you're in the key of E, or if you're in the key of D, D is not sharp and D is not flat, so that's what the D sounds like. So that is a minor seventh chord in the key of D. An A7, again, would be A, C sharp, E, and G in the key of D. So this is one of those that is going to be immediately confusing for classical musicians. This is what you would consider a dominant seventh chord, but that doesn't mean that every time you see a major seventh chord, it's a dominant seventh chord. But in the key of D, you've got A, C sharp, E, and G. Okay, and so the seventh, this is going to be the part that's confusing for classical folks. The seventh is whatever the seventh is from the root in the key that you're in. Sus chords are the next set of chords. These are not that confusing. Again, classical musicians, remember that we use we use similar names for to mean different things in popular music. So you may want to listen up for this. A sus chord is a suspension, or as much of a suspension as we have in our sort of music. And it's usually a suspended fourth, so that would be written as like a D sus, for example. Sometimes it's a suspended second, and so that would be written as like D sus2 or just D2. In both of those examples, you replace the third of the chord with whichever one is suspended. So a D sus is going to be D, instead of F sharp, you've got G, so D, G, and A. Or a D2 would be D, E, and A. So if we're in the key of D, a B sus is going to be B, E, and F sharp instead of B, D sharp, and F sharp. You suspend the third of that chord, and so you raise it into the next tone up in the key that you're in. If we're still in the key of D, and E2 is E, F sharp, and B instead of E, G, and B. So that's how susses work. The 2 just means that you use a second instead of a third as the middle tone, and then sus just means that you use a fourth instead of a third in the middle tone. The next type of chord that we are going to look at is a sixth chord. I'm sorry, let me go back and play a couple of sus chords. So a D sus, instead of, this is D, F sharp, sorry, this is D, F sharp, and A. That's a D major chord. D sus means that instead of the F sharp, you play a G. Okay, and if it says D2 or D sus2, instead of an F sharp, you play an E. And susses are interchangeable. So the D sus, or D sus2, D, E, and A could also be an A sus. So A, D, and E. So this is the very same chord as this, just in a different inversion. They're the same 3 notes, A, D, and E. Now sixth chords, and classical folks are really going to want to listen to this because we use the number 6 completely differently in classical music than we do in popular music. 6 chords, it would either be written as, for example, E6 or E add 6, are basically a triad as they would normally be in the key. So in the key of E, E, G sharp, and B, but then you add a 6th in the key of that chord. So an E add 6 would be E, G sharp, B, and C sharp. If you're in the key of D, a G6 is going to be G, B, D, and then you add just a second above that, which becomes an E. This is where it's confusing for classical folks because we use a little superscript 6 to mean that a chord is in first inversion. But 6 in this case is not shorthand for 6 over 3, 6/3, or first inversion. It means that we actually add a sixth to the chord. However, if you look at that G, B, D, and E, that could, if inversions don't matter, then that can be stacked in thirds as E, G, B, and D, which is an E minor 7 chord in first inversion, where the third is in the root instead of the root. And so yes, that is a substitution for an add 6 chord. If you've got a 6 chord, a possible substitution for that is to take whatever the 6 is and make that the root and make a minor 7th chord out of it. So yes, and I know that I told you all this time that inversions don't matter. So yeah, the E minor 7th, for example, is a substitution for G add 6. So that's really all the chord types. The next confusing thing, or the next thing that you might see in lead sheets, is this slash and then some other note. For example, you'll maybe see something like E over G sharp, or C over E, or you may even see E over A, which is a little weird. I think the one piece I was looking at had F over E. That bottom note is what's to be played in the bass, either by the bass player or the lowest note on the piano, or if you're playing guitar all by yourself, if you can try to get that note on the bottom string, then it will help. It's closer to what the composer had intended. So that's, in popular music, that's how we denote inversions, or it's generally used to denote an inversion. So everybody on top of that is going to be just playing whatever the top chord is. The bottom is for the bass player, if you've got a bass, or the bottom note in the piano. If you're a guitarist all by yourself, if you can get that in the bottom note, then it's closer to what the composer wanted. And then it's usually used not so much as an inversion, but to show that the bass has a line. So that in that E over G sharp example, you may be, if you're in the key of E, then maybe you would have an A chord, a B chord, followed by an A chord, followed by an E chord. And if you played B, A, and E on a bass, then that's a second and then this fourth down. If you change that E to a G sharp, which is still in the chord, now you've got a walking pattern on the bass. So the first example, if we were to play an A chord, oops. Don't have all the keys. And then the A chord, or that's the B chord, the A would be, and then the next one is the E chord, but so the bass on that ends up going from B to A to E. But if you make that last chord E over G sharp, then the bass has something that sounds like part of the scale. And so the bass ends up carrying something like a melody, or maybe a counterpoint to the melody. So that's generally what those are there for. Most of the time it ends up being a chord tone, and if it's a chord tone, it's most often the third. And so for those of you who are classically trained or understand classical theory, yes, this is the first inversion. But to us, inversions don't really matter so much. And then sometimes it's not a chord tone, so it would just be like a passing tone. So E over A is easier to write than A9 drop 3, which is a really complex looking chord. But E, G sharp, and B, but you've got this A in the bass. So if you separate that G sharp from it enough, then it's not as ugly sounding as it could be. So E over A is a lot easier to write than A9 drop 3. That's really all the chord types that we'll generally see in our music. If you've kept up to this point, I think the next presentation is going to be very, very, very useful to you. So stick around for that. Thanks.